In this video, we're going to talk about the main mechanisms of glomerulonephritis. So I'm going to abbreviate glomerulonephritis and just say GN for short. But essentially what we're talking about is inflammation in the glomerulus. So just to orient you, we're looking at cross-section of a capillary loop of a glomerulus. And so this is the capillary. Here is the endothelial cell lining the capillary. Here is the glomerular basement membrane in pink right here. And then on top is the podocyte. And you can see these little foot processes as they're sort of sticking out and interdigitating with each other. And then down here is the mesangium. And so I've drawn a few mesangial cells, and they're sort of the glue that's sort of holding everything together. So we're going to talk about the main mechanisms for glomerulonephritis, and the first one is immune complex mediated disease. So immune complex mediated GN is a very important cause of glomerulonephritis. There are so many diseases included in this category, and so it's definitely worth paying attention to. And so for our diagram here, I'm going to add some immune complex deposits. So you can see now that they're lining the endothelial cell, and essentially what happens is that when I'm talking about an immune complex, I mean there's an antibody binding some antigen. Okay, and so an antigen plus antibody equals the immune complex. You may be wondering, what are the antigens? Well, here they are. It could be anything like a bacterial antigen or a viral antigen, which would be exogenous type antigens. These could be autoantigens, so nuclear antigens, things that came from your own body, or the antigen could be a second antibody. So one antibody is binding another antibody, which is sort of acting like the antigen in the complex. Now, within immune complex mediated disease, there are a couple different mechanisms for how immune complexes actually cause the inflammation. For one, there could be circulating immune complexes. So a circulating antigen binds with a circulating antibody, and these immune complexes can now deposit in the glomerulus. And so some of these can deposit in the mesangial area, and some can deposit in the subendothelial area. And keep in mind, the whole point of the antibody is to help stimulate the immune system and direct its attention at wherever the antibody is. And so this Fc portion of antibody is there to recruit inflammatory cells like neutrophils. And also some antibodies can activate complement. And so remember, complement can be activated by an antibody through the classical pathway. And once complement is activated, it also recruits inflammatory cells, and it also generates the membrane attack complex, which is directly cytotoxic to cells. So once complement is activated, more inflammation occurs. And ultimately, inflammatory cells like neutrophils will arrive, and they will have direct cytotoxic effect on all the portions of the glomerulus. Alternatively, you could have a circulating antigen that first gets planted into the glomerulus, and then these planted antigens can now be bound by some circulating antibody. So in this situation, the immune complexes are sort of formed in situ within the glomerulus itself. Next, the end result is similar. Inflammatory cells are recruited and cause inflammation and eventual destruction. Next, one final mechanism is where some circulating antibody is actually binding directly to the glomerular basement membrane. And so this antibody here is reacting against the glomerular basement membrane, and this disease is called AntiGBM disease, or anti-glomerular basement membrane disease. Since these antibodies will recruit inflammatory cells, there will be subsequent inflammation and typically a necrotizing glomerulonephritis. So examples of immune complex mediated GN includes lupus nephritis, the infection-associated GNs, or they used to be called post-infectious glomerulonephritis. There's also an HIV immune complex kidney disease, IgA nephropathy, cryoglobulonemic GN, and also, as I mentioned before, anti-GBM disease. The next important mechanism is through dysregulation of the alternative complement pathway. So with immune complex mediated disease, we did talk about complement briefly, and when an antibody mediates the complement pathway and activates it, that's through what we call the classical pathway. But there's this other thing called the alternative complement pathway, which does not require immune complexes. So we mentioned complement when we were talking about immune complex mediated disease. So immune complexes can activate complement, but they activate it through something called the classical pathway. The alternative complement pathway does not require immune globulins, and it's activated slightly differently. And so it's part of our innate immune system. And we have circulating parts of the alternative complement pathway that are always a little bit activated and sort of surveying the situation. And so if they come across some foreign cell, like a bacteria or fungus or something, or if there's damaged tissue or damaged cells, it will actually start to activate, and it sort of self-propagates in a feed-forward mechanism so that we can activate complement in an antibody-independent manner, okay? And so if this is occurring, you probably are thinking, well, we need to make sure that our body doesn't auto-react against itself and cause a lot of damage, and you're right. And because of that, we have an elegant system of checks and balances on this, and so we have to have a lot of auto-regulatory proteins and things to keep this alternative complement pathway from getting out of control. Unfortunately, sometimes that happens, and when the alternative complement pathway gets out of control, it can attack the kidney, and more specifically, it can attack the glomerulus, and thus induce inflammation. So just like the classical pathway, when the alternative complement pathway gets activated, it recruits inflammatory cells. So here are neutrophils showing up, causing inflammation, and then it also generates the membrane attack complex, which is directly toxic to cells. So you're probably wondering how on earth this could actually happen. And it usually requires a combination of things to get this set in motion. And so first, usually requires some sort of environmental insult, whether it's an infection or trauma or endothelial damage. Okay, so that has to happen first to sort of start the process. And then the patient typically has to have one of these two things, either an acquired inhibitor to the alternative complement pathway. So maybe they have some new antibody that just happens to be binding one of those regulatory proteins, or the patient has a genetic mutation in one of those regulatory proteins, such that the alternative complement pathway, when activated, is overactive, can't shut down on its own, and not controlled under normal circumstances. And so unregulated activation of this can cause an aggressive GN like we see here. So here are some examples of these diseases. There's a catch-all term called the C3 glomerulopathies that includes a disease called C3GN and also another disease called dense deposit disease. And then there's also a group of diseases called atypical hemolytic uremic syndrome, which are mediated by abnormal complement deposition from the alternative complement pathway, but you also see a thrombotic microangiopathy, which leads to microthrombi forming in the glomerulus and the capillaries, and this also results in kidney failure, but you also have evidence of a microangiopathic hemolytic anemia. So the final major mechanism of GN worth mentioning is through neutrophil activation by autoantigens. So you may have heard of some of these diseases before, and these diseases involve what we call ANCAs, anti-neutrophil cytoplasmic autoantibodies. And so here's how they work. Here are circulating neutrophils just sort of minding their own business, not causing any trouble, but in the presence of ANCAs, these anti-neutrophil cytoplasmic autoantibodies, they bind to certain autoantigens on the neutrophils. And when this happens, the neutrophils become abnormally activated. And when they're activated, they're going to attack different tissues. They're going to attack the endothelial cells. As a result, these neutrophils, when they destroy endothelial cells and cause cell lysis, that actually recruits more inflammation to the area. And so it results in a vasculitis. And as I mentioned, this can occur in other organs, but when it happens in the kidney, it affects the glomerulus because that's where our capillaries are. So there's a number of diseases that are mediated by these ANCAs. There's granulomatosis with polyangiitis, microscopic polyangiitis, eosinophilic granulomatosis with polyangiitis, and each of these three diseases not only can involve the kidney, but other organs or systems. And then there's something called the renal-limited ANCA vasculitis, where this disease is only affecting the glomerulus. So those are the three main mechanisms for how we can get glomerulonephritis. And so next, we're going to go into a little more detail with specific diseases.